Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nature Connects, the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists and nature experts from New England and around the world. I'm your host today, Liz Alverson, and today we're going to hear from two experts about a critically endangered species that is now stabilizing. Thanks to the Nature Conservancy and our partners' ongoing research and careful habitat management, the bog turtle is making a comeback in Massachusetts. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Michael Jones. Mike is the state herpetologist for the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, known as MassWildlife. There, Mike coordinates statewide conservation programs for reptiles. Mike received his PhD in organismic and evolutionary biology and wildlife and fisheries conservation at UMass Amherst. He is the lead author of the Eastern Alpine Guide, a book on the natural history of alpine tundra from Labrador to New England. Mike is also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass Amherst. We'll also be hearing from Angela Sirois-Pitel, a stewardship manager for the Nature Conservancy's lands in Western Massachusetts. Angela monitors conservation easements and preserves, manages rare species and their habitats, and she creates and maintains trails and preserve infrastructure. Angela received her BA at St. Anselm College in New Hampshire and her MS at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. Her master's thesis focused, of course, on the conservation success of the bog turtle in Massachusetts. Before I hand it over to Mike and Angela, a few quick notes. They will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take your questions live. As you think of questions for Mike and Angela, please share those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems during the presentation, please let us know in the chat box, and our incredible team will be able to help you. And then for the best view of the presentation, we recommend that you go to the pull-down menu at the top center of your screen and choose Fit to Window. Thanks again so much for joining us today. Take it away, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. My name's Mike Jones. I work for the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program as the state herpetologist. I hope some of the folks on the call are familiar with the state natural heritage programs, but there's one in almost all of the 50 states. They date back to the 1970s. They were actually a nature conservancy initiative to understand and track key components of the state's biodiversity, from rare species observations to natural communities that are uncommon. They can be associated with a university. That's the case in Alaska. Here in Massachusetts, the Heritage Program is actually within the State Wildlife Agency, or MassWildlife, and it has a regulatory function. It's responsible for implementing and administering the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. We call that the MISA for shorthand, and it dates back to 1990. This is the 30-year since its passage. There are 432 plants and animals protected under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, including 6 freshwater turtles. The bog turtle is certainly the most imperiled or threatened of those. Next slide, please. In fact, wherever the bog turtle occurs, it's of concern. It's either threatened or endangered in every state where it occurs today, and it's been federally listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act since 1997. It's a very small turtle. It's one of the smallest turtles on Earth. A big bog turtle is about 4 inches long. They're very distinctive looking animals, and most people would probably agree that they're an attractive species. The shell looks like worked wood. They have a really prominent orange blotch on the side of their head. Next slide, please. This is a male from Massachusetts. This next animal here is a male from New Jersey. So you can see where the species, the genus name comes from. The genus of the bog turtle down there at lower left is Glyptemes, which means carved tortoise. So yeah, they're one of the most imperiled turtles in the world, actually. They've been affected by wetland ditching, dredging, beaver impoundment, habitat loss to development, the rise of small carnivores like raccoons, overcollection, pollution. We'll talk about some more of these in greater depth. Next slide, please. This is a map of the range of the bog turtle. I think this is really interesting to pause for a moment and consider. The overall impression here for me is a range in contraction. There are at least 5 areas generally of occurrence. We're part of that block that runs from Massachusetts to Maryland. There's also an area of occurrence in the southern Appalachians that runs from Virginia to northern Georgia. And you can see there are scattered areas of occurrence in the Finger Lakes in western Pennsylvania, and even once upon a time in the Lake George region of New York. But you can see, if you just look at Massachusetts for a moment, bog turtles are very narrowly distributed in the state. We have the sort of northeasternmost extent of their distribution, and you can only find them in Berkshire County, the westernmost county. Next slide, please. Their habitats are really pretty distinctive. Bog turtles occur in very small, discrete, open canopy wetlands. They can be very nondescript to the casual observer. They're usually dominated by grasses and sedges and forbs and low shrubs. If you're a botanist, think plants like shrubby cinquefoil or grass of Parnassus or the buckbean. Sometimes in New England, they're found in tamarack swamps. But what unites them all is that they tend to be open canopy, seldom flooded by beavers, and they're seepage wetlands. So they're seldom more than ankle deep. And if you're actually standing out there, you might see very shallow, clear rivulets flowing through the sedges. You might see mucky areas of marl, but they're very shallower. They're shallower than where you might find other species of turtle, like painted turtles or snapping turtles. And they're home to a number of other state-listed and federally listed plant and animal species. Next slide, please. Just for context, I wanted to show an image from the southern Appalachians. This is a very high elevation bog turtle site in North Carolina. And you can see here it bears some similarity to the northern sites in that it's open canopy, it's small, it's nondescript. Here it almost looks like the wet corner of a high pasture. These southern bogs can actually be a little bit more acidic. Our northern bog turtle sites are usually circumneutral, or lower acidity than other wetlands in the area, and so they're oftentimes associated with our marble or limestone valleys. Next slide, please. The bog turtle has one close living relative that's a bit more widespread. That's the wood turtle. It's in the same genus, Glyptemes. Again, it's another very attractive turtle that's facing many of the same concerns from habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. Next slide, please. The wood turtle is more widely distributed, so compared to the bog turtle's range. So here you can see the range of the wood turtle in red or pink, and it ranges all the way from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, across to Minnesota. And the bog turtle has that sort of fragmented range overlaid in orange. So 2 quick points. One, just the difference in sort of how they're distributed. Wood turtles also use much more space. They move kilometers up and down rivers, where bog turtles are constrained to these small grassy wetlands. But throughout most of that northern area, bog turtles and wood turtles probably co-occurred historically. And even today in some parts of Pennsylvania, both and other areas, they occur together. That blue mark over in Nebraska is what we know about the fossil record of this group. 11 million years ago, next slide, please, there was an animal that is part of this lineage, Glyptemes, that was found in the sandhills of northern Nebraska. So this is one of those animals. So that's about how old this particular group of turtles is. Something roughly 11 million years is about where they show up in the fossil record. Next slide, please. And the bog turtle, which is pictured there at upper right, that's our New Jersey male, we saw it first, is part of a little subfamily of turtles that is mostly North American. They're called the Imidinae, and it includes familiar species like the box turtles, the spotted turtle, the Blanding's turtle. There's even one representative in Europe. But these turtles have several things in common. First of all, they're of conservation concern pretty much wherever they occur, and for similar reasons. They're very small. Even the biggest of these are only about 2 pounds. They live an incredibly long time. These are some of the longest lived terrestrial vertebrates. They can live 80, 90, and in some cases even more than 100 years. They mature very late. A number of these species mature at age 15 to 20 years. They oftentimes nest only 1 time per year and have a very small clutch of eggs. They're very susceptible to common small predators like raccoons, skunks, foxes, even chipmunks and squirrels at various life stages. And they've been very popular in the pet trade, and unfortunately that trend is increasing. So this little group is actually most rich and diverse in New England. There are more of these species in Massachusetts and adjacent New York than anywhere else on Earth. So if they look familiar to you and you're a New England naturalist, it might be because we're sort of the center of global diversity of this group of turtles. Next slide, please. And one more piece just to further contextualize this. This group that we're talking about that includes the bog turtle first appeared, so the larger group, not the genus, showed up during the Cretaceous. So when there were still dinosaurs had 35 million years left to roam the Earth, there were animals that looked very much like this little group of colorful turtles we're talking about. There were already sea turtles, there were already snapping turtles. So most of the turtles that we know today in New England arose about 80, 90, or 100 million years ago, which to me is pretty incredible. And I try to keep in the back of my mind when thinking about how we allocate resources to protect habitat for these species. One last slide for me. Unfortunately, the bog turtle and all of these close relatives, these are wood turtles here from a recent confiscation, are being targeted by collectors for overseas pet markets, high-end pet markets. This isn't really a new problem, but it's been getting worse lately. And part of the problem is we have so few healthy sites, healthy populations of bog turtles or their close relatives, that one collector can really undermine the conservation efforts of many organizations. So a group like Nature Conservancy has been working for decades to conserve large landscapes for bog turtle, and those efforts can be undermined by collectors. Sometimes our populations only number 20 or 30 individuals, so even a small collection event can be really significant. We're working with adjacent states to develop genetic tools so we can better understand where turtles came from. If they're confiscated at JFK or at Logan, we can figure out sort of roughly which watershed they originated. We're doing a better job of marking these animals with microchips across the different species that are being targeted, and working with law enforcement to make sure that there's adequate surveillance of our most important sites. So I'd like to pass this over now to my colleague, Angela Sirois-Pitel, who will talk more about sort of the dedicated research and management efforts for the bog turtle in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Mike, so much for introducing us to that species. If you can advance to the next slide, please. Great. So in Massachusetts, there's only 2 remaining sites where we know that bog turtles still exist, and possibly less than about 150 individuals total remaining in the state. So as Mike mentioned, this is very imperiled in Massachusetts. Fortunately, both of these sites are protected under with the Nature Conservancy and MassWildlife under permanent protection. And over the last 30 years, the Nature Conservancy has partnered with various organizations, as we've mentioned, MassWildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, even the Bronx Zoo, and other research institutions to really understand not just the turtles and the populations at each of these sites, but also the vegetation, the hydrology, and we've even analyzed some pond cores to understand what the vegetation structure was like and the fire history was at these sites in the pre-colonial stages. Next slide. So a few more descriptions about the bog turtle. Obviously, Mike mentioned they're quite small individuals. So the adults are going to be less than your average cell phone in terms of the size, and their weight is kind of about the standard of an average baseball. They do have sexual dimorphism in this species. So the bottom left-hand corner picture is going to show you the male on the left and the female on the right. They often, their plastron, or the belly of the turtle, has some patchwork markings, and some populations exhibit a lot of the starburst pattern, like shown by the turtle from Eastern New York in the top right hand corner. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these sites have undergone a lot of research through the last 25 to 35 years, and in part this is due because of our method of using an adaptive management cycle for managing and restoring these populations. So with this type of management cycle, we want to go through these various iterations of monitoring them, understanding what the population should be like, what do we need to change, doing those actions, implementing it, and then re-monitoring it again. And as Mike mentioned, these are really long-lived animals. They don't reach sexual maturity until about 10 years old. So that means that we've structured our intensive monitoring cycles to be about every 10 years, so that if we do make habitat modifications, we don't necessarily expect to see changes right away, maybe in where they're using the habitat, but not necessarily in how the population is responding. So right now we are in the second iteration of these intensive cycles since the populations were really first documented and studied intensely in the 90s. Next slide. So what does it take to do all of this intensive monitoring and tracking for these animals? So first off, we need the technology. We need small radios that are light enough to fit on bog turtles and not weigh them down, and that can last a long time. Radio telemetry receivers, and then most importantly, we need a lot of dedicated field staff that are willing to go into these really remote wetlands that are sometimes, you know, just out in the middle of nowhere, laden with poison sumac, and that they're willing to go out there every single week from April to November. So as pictured here, this is Julia Vineyard. She was our AmeriCorps member who did our tracking last year. Next slide. So when tracking starts, we were really lucky this year to actually have radios on our animals over the winter time. So this is the first time ever we've actually been able to document their emergence activity in the springtime. So they emerge in the spring, late March, early April, when the weather gets up to be around 50 degrees. And so they overwinter in what's called a hibernacula, and these are tunnels and seep systems that are under trees and shrubs. And as the weather starts to warm up, they will come out and bask to get warm. And so pictured in the bottom right is an entrance, a hole to a hibernacula, and you might be able to see the little turtle that's come out and basked on the edge right there. And so a lot of these hibernaculas are communal, meaning there's often more than one turtle that uses it, or there's a few hibernacula in the same area. So the combination of them being, you know, communal and us having radios on meant that I just had an incredible amount of success this spring. It's the first time I've ever done tracking like this in spring emergence. And at one time there was an event where within 10 minutes I found like 10 animals, 3 different species. And so that was just incredible to see so many animals at this time of the year. Next slide. So even though it can be easy to find them when they're basking right out of their hibernacula, as they start to come out and emerge, they often do a lot of what's called cryptic basking. So this means that the animal is hiding under vegetation, so they're more safe. They're not fully exposed, but they're going to orient their shell in a way that they can really catch as much of those sun rays as possible. So the picture on the left and bottom show 2 images of where bog turtles are cryptically basking. The one image on the bottom is a little bit easier to see, but they can still be quite hard to find even with radios on. And then additionally, sometimes they'll bury themselves in these mucky seeps and hollows, and so you have to dig around quite a bit to actually try to find the animal. So again, even with radios on, it definitely takes a lot of persistence and patience and keen eyes and keen ears to find these animals. It's often like a little, you know, movement in the mud or a little crunch of vegetation that has resulted in me finding animals that I didn't know were hiding there. Next slide. So once we actually find the bog turtles, you know, we proceed with collecting a lot of different information. We will identify them by the notchings on their shells. These are little triangular notches we put on the edges that will code into a unique value for each turtle. We'll take pictures, we'll measure, we'll weigh, we'll try to count their annuli to see if we know how old they are. Those are going to be their growth rings. And then we'll record their location with the GPS. Next slide. So as we, you know, emerge out of springtime and into June, what we're going to start seeing is nesting activity from females. So the females will palpate to see if they have eggs. And then if we know that they have eggs, we'll try to keep an extra close eye on them and maybe doing evening surveys to see if we can catch them doing some nesting. The photo on the left shows a female bog turtle up on a sphagnum hummock. This is often a common area for them to nest. And so if we do see a female exhibiting that activity, you know, we'll leave her alone the next day or so. We'll come back and check the hummock. They've obviously hidden their eggs quite well. And if we can gently pull aside some vegetation, you know, we're lucky enough to find a nest like shown in the bottom right. The top right is the same nest, just hidden before we kind of opened up and moved the vegetation. Next slide. So throughout the summer, they really kind of decide to usually pick a certain area and hang out there for several weeks at a time. They're not usually making large movements, but as we get into September, that's when we're going to start to see bog turtle eggs hatching out. The hatchlings will usually kind of either hang out on top of the nest or plop down into a seep and wet area right on the edge so that they can be safe and hidden. And then the adults are going to start moving back into their overwintering areas. And sometimes that means that they check out a lot of different sites before they settle in, or some of them have the exact same spot they like to go to year after year, and they'll just head straight there. Next slide. So what does this all mean for, you know, all of this tracking that we've done throughout the years? And so what we have seen is, like, when we started studying the sites in the 90s, is that the animals were using one specific area, and that led to us to improve habitat management within that area. After that, we expanded some of their areas by controlling Phragmites, and what we saw in the 2008 and 2009 tracking event was that the animals expanded into the areas that we had restored and removed Phragmites. So from the 2008-2009 era up until now, we've basically just been maintaining their habitat, trying to keep it open, making sure there's not invasives. We initiated tracking again in 2018, and what we saw was, again, they're still using the same areas, but we had this one animal that brought us out to the southeastern new area that we had never, tracked turtles to before. And what we saw there was really promising conditions that we felt like it could be improved in terms of the habitat. So 2019, still tracking many of the same individuals, another turtle brings us to a new spot. And what was really exciting about this in the Northeast is that not only was it just this turtle hanging out there, but we found tons of other old and new young turtles, suggesting that maybe they've been there for several years, kind of hiding out in this area, although they are moving from that area into the historic use area. So because of some of this information we learned, we decided to pursue some funding, and we were awarded a grant from the MassWildlife Habitat Management Fund, and we were able to do some canopy thinning in that new area in the southeast. And we were really excited when we started tracking this year that just 2 weeks ago we saw animals return back to that area we had just managed. So that was great news and success of the work that we're doing out there, as well as the turtles are returning back to that northeastern area, which we think seems to be pretty established now that we've documented it. And because we've tracked a few animals throughout the different studies, all the way from the 90s to now, we really were able to key in on how important some of the site fidelity is to this overwintering areas, that the same turtles want to go to the same place year after year. And this is really important because we need to know where those areas are so that we can protect them and maintain the integrity of them. Next slide. So at Site 2, things have been a little different there. In the 2000s, well, first of all, you can tell that this site's a little bit more constricted with the uplands and the development around the wetland system. And in the 2000s, we saw animals kind of mostly using the western area, but definitely dispersed to the eastern edge of the fen. And what happened after that was some beavers moved in and started creating a series of beaver dams throughout the system there. And that caused a lot of flooding and changes of vegetation and expansion of invasive plants. And so when we monitored them in 2008 and 2009, we saw that they were fully constricted to the western edge of the fen and wetland system, where it was the most suitable habitat was present. So since then, we've worked really diligently with our partners at Natural Heritage and DFW to try to manage and improve the habitat and, kind of get some of the vegetation under control out there, but it's been a persistent challenge. So what we're still seeing is that the animals are still mostly restricted to the western side of the fen. I'm really impressed with the results that we've had at both sites. The first site we had over 70 individuals, lots of new turtles, and here we're seeing the same thing, 42 different individuals in the last few years, as well as new turtles that were never seen before. So this means that we're having successful recruitment into the adult age class, which really suggests that we're instilling some stability into the population at these sites. So next slide, please. So kind of where we are moving forward, we have a really amazing team of managers from TNC, Natural Heritage, and DFW that are working on a really comprehensive restoration plan for Site 2 so that we can really fix the hydrology issues at that site and coach it back into a more open and grassy wetland. And then we're also exploring prescribed fire again at these sites. What we know is that prescribed fire can be an excellent tool to maintain these in open grassy habitat, but we need to obviously make sure that we're balancing habitat management needs with the right protection for the turtles. So Mike, it would be great if you can maybe explain to everyone some of the success we've had in securing some funding to move forward this restoration and management.
I'd like to mention the state wildlife grants. This is a national program. Just really briefly, hopefully some of you have heard about it, but it's a congressionally appropriated program that includes a competitive program that the states can partner up and apply for funding. So we actually are now working under our second competitive state wildlife grant for bog turtle, which is led by the state of Pennsylvania. So it sort of encourages or facilitates interstate collaboration, so we can view our own effort in the context of what other states are doing for this species, and also understand what's worked elsewhere and sort of the relative significance of our own sites. We're also working with money from the Natural Resource Damages Assessment Fund, which is related to the Housatonic cleanup. So we're able to combine funds for habitat management and for monitoring to make sure that we understand, like Angela said, we understand in an adaptive way whether our management actions are working.
Great. You can go to the last slide. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike and Angela. That was terrific and so informative. Thanks for all of that information. And we just got a really cool chat from Mary, who said she used to work on Plymouth Plantation last year, and a child found a turtle, and she took a picture of it and just looked back at the turtle, and she thinks it was a bog turtle. So very neat. Thank you for sharing that, Mary. Let's dive into some questions. Angela, first, could you just tell us, how did you get so interested and passionate about bog turtles? What makes them so special to you?
Yeah, I mean, so actually my first turtle species that I started with was wood turtles, tracking them in southern New Hampshire. And then I was able to get an internship with the Nature Conservancy, and they were working on bog turtles. And so I think I've just always been drawn to like wildlife management and conservation. And honestly, the bog turtles are cute and adorable to me, and I just super enjoy like spending time with them and understanding where they like to hang out and understanding different quirks of the individuals, because I've spent the last 15 years with the species. And I think that getting to see the full spectrum of like doing the habitat management and monitoring and doing the research has allowed this like full circle view of me of like how important and valuable the work that we're doing on the ground is to the species. To like spend 3 months clipping Phragmites and then a year later see a bog turtle nesting in an area that you couldn't walk through last year. It's just incredibly meaningful to me to have that kind of impact on a species.
That's so great. And Mike, you're working on a lot of different issues at MassWildlife. Where does the bog turtle crisis fall in terms of your priorities?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. I mean, we work with most of our native amphibians and reptiles. So we have projects with diamondback terrapins on Cape Cod and Blandings turtles in Essex County and Middlesex County. To me, this feels like one of the most time-sensitive and urgent issues. Because there's so few sites, there's so few individuals. The total area that bog turtles occur in Massachusetts might be something like 30 acres or less. So it's really sort of a time-constrained push to get this right. And then a lot of the key elements that Angela mentioned are important to me too, because it sort of has this constrained footprint in Massachusetts. It makes it a little bit more manageable to do this level of monitoring than for species that are much more widely distributed. So a number of our other turtles are at risk and declining, but we have many more occurrences, and so we don't have the bandwidth or resources to sort of narrow in and look at the population level effects. So for me too, that's really rewarding.
Great. And Angela, how can people at home support the work to bring back the bog turtle population if they're really feeling like they want to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The unique thing about bog turtles is that they aren't found a lot of places. So, I mean, if you happen to have wetlands in your area and you might be within the range, I think reaching out to whatever your natural resource agents are in that area, or in Massachusetts, your conservation commissions, to understand what are the best protections you can put in place to, both protect permanently from development and then, seek guidance from people for management and restoration activities. We partner with NRCS, with farmers who might be able to use their animals to graze and restore habitat. I think that because the species is so limited, it's much more likely that you're going to have benefits to other more common turtle species that, in turn might, relate to positive activities for bog turtles, and just finding out which organizations in your area are most active in bog turtle conservation and doing whatever you can to kind of support them.
Great. And just one follow-up question to that. If we, in the general public, encounter a turtle that is crossing the road or appears to be endangered, how can we handle that? What's the best way to help them? Mike or Angela?
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, safety is paramount. So try to be aware of your surroundings and put yourself first. But yeah, we're coming off of sort of the worst few weeks for turtle road crossing mortality in New England. We still have a few bad weeks ahead of us, but usually it's early May or early June to mid-June. We see most turtles killed on the road. Moving a turtle across the road in the direction it's going can add several decades to its life in some cases. Never move it. They have such a strongly oriented sense of home that they really will try to get back. We've seen turtles that were displaced by floods try to get home. So we have a pretty good sense that if you move an animal more than a few hundred yards, it will just try to get back to where it came from. And then try to understand what it is. I would add to some of what Angela said earlier that, yeah, certainly most people don't have bog turtles on their property. If you're one of those lucky few, you've probably already been approached by agencies like NRCS, but there are funding programs that could help you manage habitat for bog turtles. But for the rest of us who are seeing more common species, some of the most encouraging or inspirational efforts I've seen for turtle conservation have been at the town level in terms of signage. Land protection remains a really big topic in some towns, and that oftentimes is the effort of many people at the town level. So I just would underscore that. Just don't underestimate the role you can play at the town level.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, we are getting lots of questions from the audience. John asked, are there plans to deal with the bog turtles' dispersed sites? Angela or Mike?
Just in terms of like how they're not well connected, I think, in Massachusetts it's a little bit more challenging. At Site 1, we're really lucky that the Nature Conservancy took an active role very on when the turtle was found there. So we've protected a 3,000-acre wetland complex so that we do have the opportunity to look for places for the animal to expand into new areas, just like we're seeing now. I think in other spots where they're more restricted, as in Site 2, we need to really invest heavily in making sure that that site can persist despite it being small and isolated. What we've seen throughout the range is that's very common for these animals to be in, 2 to 3 acre wetlands, just a few individuals, and they seem to be doing well there, but we are always looking for opportunities to restore and connect, either between actual and existing sites or between potential sites. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
I might just underscore a point you made earlier that we know that turtle populations now are most stable if they're what we call a metapopulation, which is lots of sort of small occurrences that might be on different trajectories. Some might be increasing or decreasing. And that's how we create a stable framework. And so that's within reach at our larger site that we can sort of support these patches. The other site is a little bit more concerning in that way, that there aren't as many opportunities to create a metapopulation dynamic where animals can move out of an area in response to beaver impoundment and then move back in when the beavers are gone. That's easier to do at one site than at the other. But in case you were asking about a bigger picture, one of the benefits to working with adjacent states under these competitive state wildlife grants is we're able to do these comprehensive genetic analyses. So our populations have been evaluated for things like genetic diversity to see whether there seems to be inbreeding depression or a lack of genetic diversity. That's not something we're seeing yet in the bog turtle or in related species. So it doesn't seem to be an urgent, critical problem right at this moment. But because the turtle lives so long and has such a long generation time, we shouldn't expect to see that for a few decades to come.
Great. Mike, this is a question for you. Tom asked, given the bog turtle is spread across several states, can you talk about Massachusetts and how it compares with other northeastern states in terms of their commitment to endangered species protection? And then how does that coordination work on a multi-state level?
Well, I might make 3 quick points. One is because the bog turtle is federally listed, there's an unusual partnership between federal and state wildlife agencies. So every state has a wildlife management authority and the feds are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So both are involved in every state. In some ways, because Massachusetts has such a small area of bog turtle occurrence, it allows us to allocate more resources to the sites that we do have. A site like Pennsylvania has many more occurrences, and it just by natural logical extent means it's harder to get to every population. For me, that's a reason to see merit in the state level wildlife management approach. It means that some states are able to allocate more resources to range edge populations. It's an interesting philosophical question, what to do about the northernmost range edge populations or the southernmost range edge populations. But in this case, I think it's working pretty well. And having the overlay of the state endangered species protections, the federal protections as well, a strong partner like the Nature Conservancy and a landowning agency like MassWildlife all working together suggests that this species has been a top priority since the 80s. And I think that's clear from the level of effort.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we are highly involved with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife recovery plan and implementation of that. So we're part of the Hudson Housatonic Recovery Unit, and we do meet regularly as kind of a Northeastern team to kind of connect and learn from each other and help prioritize and move forward important projects and management. And so both of us have been involved to that as much as possible. And I think that, as Mike suggested, like because of the ability that we have had to invest in our sites, we and at times are on kind of the leading edge of like understanding the restoration and management of these sites, because we have documented them so well and we've studied them and been able to do so much restoration at 2 specific sites. So not a big scope, but well studied of the 2 sites that we have.
Thanks so much, guys. Patricia wants to know, and this is probably a great question for Angela, can you talk a bit more about how microchips are being applied and used to monitor and track the turtles?
Yeah, so as of right now, we're not using any of the microchips in bog turtles, definitely not in Massachusetts. I know they're exploring using it more regionally to keep track of animals. And so Mike, you probably have a little bit more that you might want to add to that specific question.
I would just add too, yeah, we're using them sort of across the board on the red-bellied turtles that live in southeastern Mass, and more on diamondback terrapins from Cape Cod to the lower Taunton River. So their species are sort of coming online. And we have 3 species now in Mass that are really heavily microchipped. But it takes a certain critical mass to get, because everyone needs an expensive scanner. So they're sort of coming on sequentially. But Angela, I wonder if you agree that I would expect 10 years from now, we'll have a substantial microchip effort for bog turtles.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the system we're working with now is great, but like you'll get a turtle and maybe they have some shell damage or something happens. And so those little notches that usually tell us who is who can sometimes be damaged. And we definitely have instances where like, oh, we don't actually know who this turtle is. Or like, if you have a turtle move from one population to another, a microchip is like a much more stable identifier for the long term. But yeah, we're just not there yet.
Okay, wonderful. We have a couple of folks, Dave and Leslie, both are asking about climate change and how climate change is impacting the bog turtle population. Mike, did you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for all turtles, this is a really complicated question. I mean, in Massachusetts, we should be expecting more precipitation in bigger events. We should expect a warming trend. So for some species, you might expect that at the northern extent of their range, they would do better because they're, if they were originally constrained because their nest weren't making it out of the ground. That was probably the case with the red-bellied turtle in Plymouth County, Mass. But that's a simplistic view, I think, of the whole thing. We should expect this incredibly complex, synergistic response. It's going to matter what happens to raccoons and minks and otters and skunks. All of these sort of structural components that make up a bog turtle fen are going to respond independently. And then the bog turtle is going to be one of the slowest things to show that response. So hopefully at the northern edge of the range, the result isn't catastrophic. But everywhere in the range margin, we should be concerned about sort of very rapid environmental change. This is not an animal that is used to that.
Yeah, and I'll add that in Massachusetts, we're trying to apply our larger scale climate change resiliency modeling and data down to the level at our sites. And so one of the sites we've already applied this, and what was really positive was that we've already documented that the site is well protected against climate change, that it's already designed in a way that, because of the protection we've done, to inherently give it a lot of resiliency. So the other site might be a little bit more vulnerable because of the high level exposure to development right in its vicinity. So I think the context matters really site to site. But we're also looking at things like how can we continue to manage hydrology and ongoing vegetation management, all of those things that might threaten them in the future.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Regina asked, could you explain in more detail what you actually do to restore an area?
Sure. Yeah. So we do a lot of thinning of woody vegetation in the wintertime when the animals are dormant and underground. So that's going in with a handsaw or a chainsaw or something like that and manually cutting down shrubs. The challenge of that is they will grow back if you're not using something more permanent to actually kill them. So that's like one of the biggest techniques we use at a site to just keep it open. So, in the past, we might have had large grazers like moose and other animals that were constantly munching down the vegetation and keeping it open, and we just don't have those anymore, or it was being burned more regularly. And then invasive plant control, a lot of these are on the edges of development. So we're constantly going to have introduced species coming in that could easily take over and colonize. So we're moving those invasive plants to keep it open. Those are the two biggest things we do to manage their habitat.
Great, thanks so much. Do you think that it's possible that there are other sites beyond the two that you mentioned, Angela, where bog turtles could exist in Massachusetts?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a site that had been documented in the 80s that had some animals, and we have been trying to get back. We've gotten back there, and we've done some trapping, we've done some sampling, we've yet to turn up a turtle, but there's lots of places in the areas that we look and we're like, this looks like great bog turtle habitat. But given the fact that they can be at our site where we know that they are and we can't even find them sometimes, it just goes to show that it's incredibly hard. And, more resources to trap and monitor and survey at these, spring events will help hopefully turn up other sites that we don't know about.
Great. This could be a question for either of you. David asks, have you been able to do any genetic studies to look at inbreeding for depression, seeming that the species is very small and isolated? It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so Mike mentioned that a little bit, and some of our animals were part of Kevin Schumacher's research into that. So Mike, if you want to highlight, some of the results of that Kevin found of that long-term kind of lack of inbreeding depression that they've seen and the population modeling.
Yeah, I would just say, so for bog turtle and then also for some of these related species, we've been able to partner with other states so that it's not just in a vacuum looking at the Massachusetts populations, and we have a better sense of that genetic landscape or the context. And so far, the results suggest that the populations are not genetically inbred, and there is actually some level of connectivity in New York, not necessarily in Massachusetts where they're much more widespread. But it is clear from the preliminary genetic work that most of the important populations don't yet seem to be genetically inbred, and then that there's also some level of overland movement that's hard to detect through these other methods, radiotelemetry and capture-recapture. But the genetic tools are really rapidly evolving. So genomic techniques are becoming available. And so again, if we fast forward 5 or 10 years, I think I expect we'll also be a part of those genetic analyses that give us a much better sense, not only of that question, but also, what's the relatedness of these animals look like? So if we have 42 animals known at site 2, who's related to who in terms of sibling relationships and parent-offspring relationships, and where else do we see them on the landscape? These are important questions in understanding how the animal that can live for so many decades, is actually operating at landscape scales.
Great, thanks so much. John's asking a really interesting question. Do we have a sense of the survival rate of young turtles? Is there a quote unquote Head Start program for young turtles like there is for other turtles?
So right now for bog turtles in Massachusetts and in the Northern Range, there's no head starting programs right now. So they don't have the same level of survivorship as adults do. They're small and they're definitely vulnerable. Their nests are, anything from shrews to ants can, eat their nests. But what we've seen from population modeling is that often it is that the adults live for a long time and reproduce for a long time. So, once they turn 10, they can start breeding. And then if they can live 50 years, that's a lot of breeding age. So we have found, even though it's valuable to protect those nests, right now the most critical part is just making sure the adults live for a really long time. Do you agree, Mike?
Yeah, and this is becoming more widely understood among naturalists and ecologists, I think, but the difference between one nest and one reproductive adult is really immeasurable. That most population modeling scenarios make it clear that protecting one adult is really, really the way to keep these populations stable. One thing I would point out too is that all the turtles in this group that we've been talking about, including the bog turtle, don't senesce reproductively, so they can continue to reproduce throughout their entire life. So if they're living 60 or 70 years, they'll probably be reproducing right to the end of that.
Excellent. I believe this question is for Angela. Douglas asks, you use the term fen to describe the habitat. Am I correct in thinking that these may be more acidic places? The question just disappeared, sorry. But I was asking about the soil of these areas. Are they more alkaline or acidic than other areas in Massachusetts?
Yeah, so the fens are here. They're circumneutral, so they're not as acidic as traditional wetlands and swamps. And so fen is just like kind of this nuanced term that like us botanists and bog turtle biologists refer to, because they're these low, open, like kind of grassy areas. It's very descriptive of the vegetation, and then that you have these like little seeps that are running in and out, these little seeps and rivulets that go throughout the area. And so it is a descriptive kind of that low vegetation, and usually because it's not as acidic, you get a different assemblage of plants there than you would other places. And in these sites, it's really driven by the limestone bedrock. So all the water that's going down through the limestone bedrock in the surrounding areas, and the water pops out in these springs, it has this like harsher chemistry that is more alkaline than typical wetlands.
Mike, anything to add, or is that?
No, Angela said most of it, except the bog turtles in the northern part are associated with all these marble and limestone exposures.
Great.
Yeah.
Joel asks, are there any endangered herps or insects that share the habitat with bog turtles, and how do you integrate habitat management for multiple species?
Yeah, so both of these sites are kind of hotspots for all sorts of other threatened and rare and endangered species. And so we tend to use the bog turtle as an umbrella species to do management that's going to benefit a ton of other things. But because we have like a really wide-ranging team of members that like cover a variety of species, we are lucky that we always kind of either someone on our team understands what the specific needs might be of another endangered or threatened species. We can make sure that like the stuff that we're doing for bog turtles isn't going to negatively harm any of the other species. And that's also where kind of, we have to apply for the same permitting that everyone else does. So we have to get permission from our Conservation Commission. Natural heritage staff still have to review everything we do to make sure that we're really thinking comprehensively about all the species. And we've had some incredible success. Like one of the sites where we've done some restoration to get rid of a farm pond, we had all of these uncommon wetland species show up, including some state rare species just pop up out of nowhere. We just did good management and good things happen. So we've been really successful in that regard.
Great. I was hoping to do a couple rapid fire questions about bog turtles, because we're getting a lot of questions that are more just short ones about some of their behavior. So what do they eat?
Yeah, so I actually just pulled it out at the last second. They like to eat slugs and snails and invertebrates and all kinds of like whatever. They're omnivores, so kind of like whatever they'll catch themselves on. I had this great picture of like a bog turtle cover and all this like slug slime on their face. But we haven't done any specific food studies in Massachusetts. Do you have anything to add to that, Mike?
No, that's what I would have said.
Yeah.
Okay. Mike, maybe you can answer this one. How large are bog turtle eggs?
Oh, they're small. They're less than an inch. Geez, they're 3/4 of an inch or so. They're very small.
Okay.
So, yeah, they're oblong too. So if a bog turtle nest is one of the least likely things for somebody to encounter accidentally. So if you're thinking you might have found one, it's unlikely. But
yeah, 2 to 3 eggs usually.
Yeah. But all of our turtles, except the snapping turtle, have an oblong egg, and the bog turtles is very small.
And what would the age be of first reproduction for a bog turtle?
It's usually around 10 years old, but we also kind of base some of that based on the measurement of the body of the animal. The females we measure those and use those metrics. So it's about like 60 to 70 millimeters long.
Great. Evan is wondering about the beavers. So haven't turtles and beavers coexisted for tens of millions of years? What's the problem now?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, I could jump in on this one because this is an interesting part of the whole context for bog turtle, and it also affects animals like wood turtle and Blanding's turtle, because you're absolutely right that historically all these animals had to deal with beavers on the landscape and probably even benefited to a certain extent and under certain circumstances. The problem with bog turtle, first, we don't have a good sense of how many of these wetlands we lost. They're relatively easy to ditch and fill and drain. And so, leading up to their first discovery in Massachusetts in the 1960s was when the first animal was found. We don't have a good sense of how many of these wetlands we've lost. But historically, if we go back 100 years or 200 years, probably there was more potential habitat, especially during that agricultural boom in Massachusetts. And if beavers moved into one area, it wouldn't have been catastrophic. Those very long-lived bog turtles probably just would have moved into nearby habitat. The problem now is we have such a constrained footprint where the available habitat is hemmed in by roads, and there really aren't corridors that these animals can move several kilometers if they need to find something new.
Great. We have a question about the image of the turtles rescued at Kennedy Airport. So it mentioned laundering. What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, that's a problem. So actually, the bog turtle is federally threatened. So to own it or to have it in your possession anywhere in the United States needs a permit. So the burden of proof is on you as the person who has a bog turtle in your possession to demonstrate to law enforcement. The problem facing a lot of our other turtles is that they're only protected at the state level. So if you successfully get these turtles out of the state where they're protected, I say they've been laundered, because then the burden is on law enforcement to prove where you got them. Does that make sense? So for a lot of turtles, there's laundering going on where animals are moved out of the states that protect them into a state like Florida or California. They export them, which is a technically legal thing to do from California or Florida. And it's only if the species has federal protection, like the bog turtle, that it's easy to put an end to that.
And Mike, a related question for Mary. What happens to the illegally collected turtles that you confiscate?
Well, we're trying to refine that process. So using genetic tools. So sometimes you know from surveillance and what you learn from law enforcement exactly where they were collected. There have been cases in the news where somebody was arrested immediately after collecting the turtles, and there's some intelligence or surveillance information that you know where they came from and can move on that. If they show up at JFK or if they show up at Logan and you just don't know anything more about them, we're trying to refine these tools where we analyze blood samples to understand which basin they came from. Then that state is engaged to figure out what to do next. So you can imagine, just like we were talking about earlier, Massachusetts views the bog turtle differently than other states that have 50 or 100 occurrences. And that's true for each species, that having this sort of patchwork of northeastern states means that each state has a different perspective on the species that are being heavily traded, so they'll make those decisions differently. But we are, as a network of states, trying to improve the tools that we have available to deal with confiscations.
Okay. Angela, this can't be ignored because I'm getting a lot of questions. People want to know what is in the tank behind you that's moving. It's been a lot of questions.
That is our 15-year-old blue-tongued skink. I was hoping he was going to stay quiet for the presentation, but now he's deciding to rummage around in there. Yeah, he was inherited from a friend, and his name is Yali. He's quite a nice office companion.
Thank you for that. Back to the DNA theme for a minute. What about looking at the environmental DNA and the outflows from some of the seeps where bog turtles might be but haven't been found recently? Have you all thought about that?
Yeah, so again, that's something that's hard for any one state or partner to take on. So it's been another benefit of these multi-state partnerships. Dr. Hyatt Green has been the principal investigator on that. So we have contributed samples from Massachusetts of known areas where bog turtles were found, and it's in development. So it's more promising, I think, for animals like wood turtle that are found in clear, cold streams. The bog turtle, where you're recovering so much organic sediment around them, poses other filtering challenges. But again, hopefully, I mean, we're working on it with partners, and hopefully 5 or 10 years out, that's more promising. It would be a wonderful way to figure out if any of these upstream headwater wetlands are still occupied. And just for people who aren't familiar with that technique, for the last 7 or 8 years, environmental DNA, longer probably, has been really taking over. It's sampling water and trying to determine if a target species is present based on just suspended DNA in the water.
Angela, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate enough, so about 2 years ago, we had the first ever national bog turtle conference where we got together the northern and southern range experts, and we got to hear a bit about the progress they're making with environmental DNA testing with bog turtles. And so I was really excited to hear the progress they have made. But as Mike stated, it's just not there yet, particularly in terms of one, the how reliable the results are and the cost effectiveness of it. So right now it's pretty expensive to run these tests, and it can be equally, and more valuable to send someone out with 50 traps to just heavily trap a site, and you're more likely to get results based on the investment of resources at that level.
Great. So given that the smaller territory requirement of the bog turtle compared to, say, the wood turtle, it would seem that protection would be easier. Why is the bog turtle in a significantly more threatened position?
I'll jump in. Well, I have two quick thoughts. One is first of all, the bog turtle probably naturally never really extended past Berkshire County, Mass. So we've always been working with a really small footprint. So just again, our perspective on the species, but then if you is different. A number of our other species are, I would say, better protected by state wetland regulations. So where the wetlands are more permanent or more visible or clear or associated with rivers, they get protections that have nothing to do with wildlife or biodiversity or endangered species. So just as an example, the wood turtle, which is a river species, you could argue is protected by the Massachusetts Riverfront Act, which was an addendum to the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act that just protects rivers. And so the bog turtle wetlands are so small and isolated that I think that is another factor that has made them easier to ditch and drain over time, even before any of these state laws that we're talking about.
Right, and I think we lost a number of sites before a lot of our regulations went into place. Like in Eastern New York, the sites that I'm familiar with are often in really close proximity to existing agricultural areas. So in many cases, these wetlands and even our sites have experienced agriculture in their past. Like there's remaining ditches in our sites from when they used to be pasture. And so there was just, these are great, they weren't great. So the surrounding areas were good soil. And so these became pastures that they would put livestock in. And so I think we're just in a lot more close proximity. And as Mike mentioned, it's just a different structure of protection.
Excellent. Angela, one final question for you, because we're getting close to the end. So Jeff would like to know, have you collaborated with other Nature Conservancy chapters on bog turtle restoration at all, or has this solely been a Massachusetts endeavor?
Yeah, I've worked really closely in the past with our Eastern New York chapter, managing some of their bog turtle sites there. And so they've been doing restoration. They started using goats to graze in their sites for habitat restoration. And then through the years, I've also been in contact with George Kress, who manages the populations at Nature Conservancy Preserves in Pennsylvania. And so, there's not, we could always use more sharing and collaboration in terms of lessons learned and techniques and things like that. But, when I did attend that National Bog Turtle Conference, one thing that really impressed me was that throughout the range of the species, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the state agencies are the lead on, protecting these species. But in terms of conservation organizations, TNC was the one persistent factor throughout all states that we're present in bog turtle conservation throughout the range. And so I was really proud and happy to see, how dedicated we are. Even if we're not totally coordinated in each site, we've recognized the value of protecting the species.
Mike, did you have anything to add?
No, that's clear to me too. This has been a state TNC partnership throughout, and from what I know of adjacent state regions, especially in the north, that's certainly been true.
Great. Well, we are almost near to the end of the hour. Is there anything that you guys wanted to add for final notes? Anything people should know? Anything we should have asked you that we didn't ask?
I think the only question that I haven't gotten that I almost always get is how long do bog turtles live? And we don't know that for sure, but we know that upwards of 50 years seems highly reasonable, and potentially older. We have turtles that were first marked in the 1980s as adults, meaning they were 10 years old, and I'm still finding them today. And so that's super exciting. They're probably older than I am. And so yeah, I think that's one cool fact to kind of keep in mind.
Any final thoughts, Mike?
No, I appreciate everyone's interest. I appreciate the chance to sort of profile this effort. And I would just encourage you again, if you're interested at all in turtles, to think about how to get involved locally. I can't overstate how important local conservation efforts have been to some of our other turtles as well. So there are ways to get involved and help our other 9 species of turtle in addition to the bog turtle a little closer to home.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much for being here. It's always so wonderful to see how many of you are tuning in week to week. And thank you so much for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is really what makes all of this work possible. You can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And just a note, we will be off next week for the holiday, but back July 9th, where we'll be talking with our federal government relations lead, Emily Myron, about the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the most important conservation program you've probably never heard of. At the beginning of the program, we're going to be joined by a very special guest, Congressman Jim McGovern. So please tune in for that. I think it's going to be a really special one. You can find the full webinar schedule and past recordings at nature.org/MA-webinars. We'll be sending along a thank you email over the coming days with links to the resources that we talked about today and a recording of the webinar. And if you're enjoying these webinars, please do tell a friend about them. And if you're not enjoying them, please email us and tell us why. Thank you all so much. Goodbye, and wish you a happy 4th. Thanks, Angela and Mike.
Thank you very much.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.